Someone once suggested that I was naive, that I didn't understand how the world worked, that I needed to wake up, get with the program, and start playing the game like everybody else. And I want to tell you what I told them. I told them I learned the rules so that I know how to properly break them. That is not naivete, that is strategy, and it is exactly what Yeshua modeled. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany, the Valiant Coach. I'm a U.S. Air Force veteran, a certified integrative somatic trauma informed practitioner, and I walk with Black women into the healing their bodies have been waiting for. We are in week 2 of Stop, Look, and Listen. And this week, we're talking about wisdom, not the kind that keeps you safe by keeping you small, the kind that sees the system clearly, navigates it precisely, and refuses to be consumed by it. Last week, we talked about humility that doesn't shrink, and Yeshua withdrew from the crowd's crown because he already knew whose declaration held authority over his life. This week, we go one level deeper because knowing who you are is one thing, but knowing the world you're operating in, its systems, its structures, its rules, its pressure points, that is a different kind of wisdom. And it is one that gets misread constantly, especially right now. There are people looking at those who are resting, who are still, who are not scrambling, who are not performing urgency for the watching crowd. And they're calling it naivete, calling it passivity, calling it a failure to understand what is happening. I want to be very clear. We see exactly what is happening. We just also see what is happening behind it. And those are two very different vantage points. He that has ears, let him hear. In Matthew 22, the Pharisees are trying to trap Yeshua. They ask him, is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? They think they have him. And Yeshua asks, whose image is on the coin and whose inscription? Caesar's, they say. Then render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The trap collapses. They walk away amazed. Now, here is what I need you to see. Yeshua did not pretend Caesar didn't exist. He did not spiritually bypass the Roman system as though it had no power. He looked at the coin, he named the image, he acknowledged the reality of the world he was operating in, and then he drew a line. Caesar gets what belongs to Caesar, but Caesar does not get what belongs to God. That is not submission to the system. That is surgical precision within it. He knows the rules well enough to navigate them without being owned by them. He gave Caesar exactly what Caesar was owed, no more, no less, and he retained everything that Caesar had no jurisdiction over. That is wisdom about the system. Now, I want to take you somewhere else because Matthew 22 shows us wisdom in the moment. Exodus 14 shows us wisdom in the waiting. The Israelites are at the Red Sea. Pharaoh, their Caesar, is behind them with his full army, chariots, and horses. Everything in the natural says, you are trapped, and this is the end. And Moses says something that should have sounded impossible. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance Yahweh will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Yahweh will fight for you. You need only to be still. Stand firm. Be still. Now, the people who are watching this from the outside, who didn't know what Moses knew, who couldn't see what was working behind the scenes, what did the stillness look like to them? It looked very naive. It looked very passive. It looked like a people who didn't understand the severity of what was bearing down on them. But here's the truth. They understood perfectly. They saw Pharaoh. They knew his army. They felt the ground shake under his chariots. They were not unaware of what Caesar was doing. They were aware of something Caesar had no access to. Yahweh was working in the dimensions that Pharaoh's chariots could not reach, behind the scenes, beneath the surface, in the spiritual geography that earthly systems never would be able to map. And the instruction was not to fight. The instruction was not to perform urgency for the watching crowd. The instruction was to stand still and watch. Not being naive, that was the most sophisticated, strategic position available because it requires you to trust intelligence that the enemy cannot intercept. And then there's the boat. In Mark 4, Yeshua and the disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee. A furious storm comes up, waves breaking over the boat. The disciples, experienced fishermen, men who knew water, are terrified. And Yeshua is in the stern, asleep on a cushion. The disciples wake him. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? And he gets up, rebukes the wind, says to the waves, quiet, be still. And there is a great calm. And then he turns to them and asks, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And I want you to sit with that image of being in the bottom of that boat, not panicking on the deck with the disciples, eyes on the waves, hands on the ropes, voices raised in fear, but in the stern, in the place of rest with the one who owns the storm. That is discernment. That is what it looks like to be dialed into the frequency that the world cannot access. Not because you don't see the waves, you see them, but you also know who is in the boat with you. And the people on deck, looking at your stillness in the middle of the storm, they'll call it naive. They will say, don't you care? Don't you see what's happening? And the answer is yes. And I also know what's about to happen. He's about to speak to it. Here's where I need to bring this into the body, because staying in the bottom of the boat is not a passive act. Your nervous system was designed to respond to threat, to mobilize, to scan, to prepare for danger. That is not a character flaw. That is biology. But when the threat is constant, when Caesar is always at the door, when the storm is always on the water, the nervous system can get stuck in that mobilized state, always scanning, always prepping, never resting. And a nervous system that cannot rest cannot hear that still small voice. Some of you have seen the film Leave the World Behind, and I want you to bring that into your body for a moment. There is a family in the basement of their own house, and on the wall, the art depicts the stern of a ship. At first glance, it reads as a slight. Even one of the characters is insulted by it. Why are we down here? Why are we in the back? Why are we beneath the surface while everyone else is above? But then the camera finds the woman upstairs in the house. The art in her room appears as if she's on deck. Still, she is completely undone. She's educated, resourceful, confident. She has operated beautifully in a world that was stable. But the moment the frequency shifted, the moment the ground began to tremble, she had no framework for what was happening. She is on deck, eyes on the waves, hand looking for ropes that no longer hold. The people in the basement, the ones whose wisdom filled that house, who built that space, who had already anticipated this kind of moment, they are positioned exactly where they need to be. The basement was never the demotion. The basement was the sanctuary. The stern was never the slight. The stern was the strategy. That is what it looks like when your nervous system has been trained, not by performance metrics and approval loops, but by wisdom, by ancestral knowing, by the kind of discernment that comes from staying low to feel what is trembling in the ground. That's why the enemy works so hard to keep you on the deck in a state of urgency. Not because urgency protects you, but because urgency keeps you up top, eyes on the waves, hands on the ropes, instead of in the stern with the one who can actually do something about the storm. The practice of rest, deliberate, chosen, Covenantal rest is not passive. It is an act of warfare. It is saying, I trust the intelligence I have received from the source that Caesar cannot intercept. I will stand still. I will be in the boat. I will stay in the basement and I will watch Yahweh work. Wisdom about the system means you see Caesar clearly. You know his rules. You understand his structures. You can name his image on the coin without flinching. And you give him exactly what he is owed, no more, no less. But you do not give him what belongs to God. Not your peace, not your rest, not your assignment, not your identity, not your faith, not your stillness in the storm. And those things never belong to Caesar. And no system, no matter how loud or powerful, has jurisdiction over what Yahweh has already claimed. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed how animals behave differently before a storm arrives? Before the earthquake hits, before the floods come? They feel it in the ground before any instrument registers it. They sense the frequency shift before the human eye can see what's coming. That is not magic. That is connection. They have never severed their relationship with the earth beneath their feet. There are people, whole communities, who have carried that same embodied knowing for generations, who put their ear to the ground and felt what was trembling on the horizon long before it arrived, not because they were supernatural, but because they stayed connected to a frequency that power has a way of severing. And here is what power does. It elevates you so high that your feet no longer touch the ground. And when your feet no longer touch the ground, you lose the frequency. You lose the trembling. You lose the warning that has always been available to those who stayed low enough to feel it. Caesar cannot feel what is coming, not because the information isn't available, but because the elevation that felt like winning is actually the disconnection that made him deaf. You, the one they call naive, unqualified, not ready, you have had your ear to the ground the whole time, and you felt it coming. And here is the word that seals it. Romans 8:28 through 30. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined. Those who he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. Not some things, all things, including this storm, including this Caesar, including this mess that the most qualified, most prepared, most long awaited person created and now cannot navigate his way back out of. All of it is working for the good of those who Yeshua foreknew. Yeshua wasn't surprised by the storm. He made the water. He foreknew the storm before the disciples ever stepped into the boat. And he was already in the stern, resting, because he knew exactly what he was going to say when this moment came. That's not being naive. That is the peace of someone who has read the end of the story. So if someone looks at your rest right now and calls it passive, let them. You're in the bottom of the boat. You know who's in there with you. You felt what was coming long before they did, and you know what he's about to say to the storm. Stand firm. Be still. Watch. He that has ears, let him hear.